Welcome back to this episode of Behind the Bumpers. Joining me today is Hall of Fame Team 111 WildStang, currently at the Midwest Regional tearing it up. We've got Elliot, Ronnie, Adrian, and Michael here to take us through their robot this year and some of the changes they've made since the Northern Lights Regional. Check it out on this episode of Behind the Bumpers. Elliot, go ahead and take us through your intake this year.
Okay, so last competition we actually did not have an intake, or a ground intake. We just had a human player station intake. So we realized our last competition, we worked out pretty well, we had a good auto, but what really suffered is playing teleop under defense. It was very hard to align and make sure that the human player could get on really easily. So we decided, and we were also watching other matches, and we saw other teams have great success with ground intakes, like 1778 and bare metal. So we decided to have a ground intake. We looked at all those teams and we looked at how we could make a ground intake work. So our ground intake's pretty normal, but we have kind of three things that might be a little special. So first we have this floating roller. It helps the coral come in, especially when it's oriented perfectly perpendicular to the intake. And then we also have this bottom roller, which can lift the coral up when it's perpendicular as well, instead of just having a pad. And the last thing that's pretty interesting is this polycarb centering. We copy this pretty much from bare metal. It works out really well, and it means we don't have to use wheels after the intake to center the robot like a lot of other teams have.
All right, can we go ahead and feed a coral through and see this transition as it moves through the robot? All right, and Elliot, I noticed that you have two different Neo motors on this intake. Can you tell us a little bit about what those are doing for you?
Yeah, so our intake has a kind of unique feature to it. Because of these two motors, we can stage a coral right here for L1. So these rollers spin forwards and these spin backwards, and then we keep a coral right in the middle. And that can allow us to score L1 really easily. And that's our L1.
All right, Ronnie, go ahead and take us through the rest of your elevator and arm mechanism.
All right, so all this elevator and arm mechanism is pretty much the same as what we had at Northern Lights. We just made some improvements. So starting off, you can see our coral gripper here. So it has these internal rollers that basically allow the coral to go inside of the gripper, and it allows for more traction on the coral and is a lot harder to remove from our intake, which is really helpful because we have a dual-ended intake with coral and algae, which means that we can do super cycles, which are picking up algae, scoring the coral, and then going to score the algae. And then when we're picking up the algae, the coral is upside down. So having these internal rollers is really helpful to get the grip on the coral we need so it doesn't fall out. There's also a 6-inch offset between this coral gripper and the algae gripper, which allows for us to pick up an algae and score a coral in one fluid motion, as opposed to having to pick up the algae, back away, and move our arm up to score the coral. And this allows for much more fluid cycling. We have our lift here, which has 2 vortexes and a aluminum barrel and spectra rigging on the other end of it on that side. Just allows for a really quick intake, or quick lift, sorry. And it allows us to get much faster cycles. And then on this end, you can look at our algae gripper, which we've improved the compression, or we've reduced the compression on it since our last competition because we dealt with algae falling out of our claw a lot, and when we couldn't actually score the algae when we picked it up. So we reduced the compression and added a laser can in there so we can sense when there's an algae in our robot, and so it doesn't fall out. And we also switched a lot of our pieces to max composite, which is what you can see here. Also SRPP, which is polypropylene. And you can kind of see a little bit here. It's like polycarb, but it's a lot lighter. And we ran into a lot of weight issues after our first competition because at Northern Lights, we were basically at 115 pounds. And we wanted to add this about 16-pound ground intake. So we had to remove 16 pounds somewhere on the robot. And max composite has really helped us lose a lot of excess weight. So you can kind of see our carriage used to be aluminum. Now it's max composite. Our coral gripper and our climb are also max composite now.
All right, awesome. Let's go ahead and pass it over and talk a little bit about your climber.
All right, so we had to cut weight, as previously mentioned, we had to cut weight from the intake. We cut half the weight from Northern Lights to Midwest on our climb. Before, it was pretty much a every bot climb, but we completely redesigned it. We use max composite because it's lighter, and when we climb, we sometimes have an issue that we disengage from the climb. So we designed a ratchet system over here. It's pretty much just the same dimensions as one of these gear ratios, but it's just a servo that engages a ratchet. So when we climb, we hold it. Another thing, our belly pan. All our electronics are mounted on the bottom to protect them because coral electronics will mix well. And we added this polycarb piece so we get coral stuck on top of it. We can just lift the arm up a little bit and just start spinning, the coral gets unstuck.
Awesome. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about what goes into the software of this robot to make this thing actuate.
Okay, so of course, the main goal of software is to assist the driver in what he wants to do. So in addition to the operator inputs, which select things like L1 and L4, we also go based off of where the robot is on the field and some other sensors so that the robot does what the driver wants it to do. A big part of that what goes into that is the localization of the robot. And for that, we have 2 limelights on the front of our robot, which we learned in 2023 that it's better to have them cross-eyed, which this enables us to whenever we're scoring, whether it's left or right branch, we can always see an April tag and get an accurate pose using Mega Tag 3. And we're actually running 3 limelights for this competition, which is one more than Northern Lights. We have one up here, which we use for object detection, which through a series of transforms, we get a position on the field for a coral, which allows us to drive to that point. And this is a series of upgrades to our auto that we're preparing for champs to be able to have a ground intake 4-piece to 5-piece auto. And we can also switch between April tag and game piece pipelines during match. So when we're not using it to intake a coral, we can have 3 cameras looking for April tags to have very accurate localization.
All right, thanks for watching this episode of Behind the Bumpers. Good luck to Team 111 WildStang at the Midwest Regional, and we'll see you at championships. Thank you, guys.